Hello, everyone, and welcome back after our short break. And hello, Adrian. Nice to see you. We now engage in the sort of like final section of today's program, which will feature a number of conference presentations and a literature on excerpt of a literature reading. But before we get that far, we start out with Adrian Ivakhiv's presentation. I'll just offer a brief introduction here. So Adrian Ivakhiv is a professor of environmental thought and culture at the University of Vermont, with a joint appointment in the environmental program and the Rubinstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. He's UVM University Scholar and Public Humanities Fellow, and recently held the Stephen Rubinstein Professorship for Environment and Natural Resources. He heads the Eco-Culture Lab, which organizes collaborative engagements between ecologically oriented artists, scientists, humanists, and the broader community. Professor Ivakhiv is a cultural theorist and an eco-philosopher whose research and teaching are focused on the intersections of ecology, culture, identity, religion, media, philosophy, and the creative arts. His books include Claiming Sacred Ground, Pilgrims and Politics at Glastonbury and Sedona, Ecologies of the Moving Image, Cinema, Affect, and Nature, and Shattering the Anthropocene, Eco-Realism for Turbulent Times. With its historical breadth and theoretical innovation, Ecologies of the Moving Image has been called capacious and authoritative, groundbreaking, and a landmark contribution to the growing field of ecological cultural studies, and the first book of eco-film philosophy. And as a sort of avid reader, I can testify to that characterization for sure. Expanding and deepening the eco-philosophy of the earlier book, Shattering the Anthropocene, which followed, presents a process-relational philosophy of life, a philosophy that sees images as part of the battleground in which humans contest the meanings of an increasingly turbulent world. His current projects include a book entitled The New Lives of Images Toward an Ontology of the Image World, a book on the Chernobyl Zone of Exclusion and the Philosophy of Time, a collaboration on ecological themes and approaches across the arts, and an anthology of writings on spiritual practice. So we're very excited to have you here today to offer your presentation. And I guess I'll just leave the floor to you to do your talk, and then we can do a little Q&A discussion afterwards.
Thank you so much, Nikolai. I'm sharing my screen. Let me know if you're not seeing it.
Right now, I'm not seeing it. Let me just...
You're not?
Mm-hmm.
How's that?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
Thank you.
So thank you for that wonderful introduction. This talk won't be so much about the garden, which we co-create symbiotically with other creatures, nor will it be about the dump, at least not exactly, the dump which we create usually without intending to while pursuing other things. It will be about a place in between the two and also quite beyond them, a place I'll call the zone. A space-time that approaches us, creeping stealthily over the horizon, and one that we are already well inside. A zone that opens up before us with unclear boundary and transition markers that we enter into at various rates, and which affords us complex traps. I'll begin with a few epigraphs that you can read to yourselves. Part 1. What have we wrought? Who, we. What should we love? How should we love it? There are places from which humans have vanished. Abandoned places. Places turned into scrapyards. Zones from which we bar our own access. Zones we only visit in dreams. Places of memory, layered with forgetting. Places into which intrepid explorers venture. There are those who wish not to leave, and those who have returned. There are signs of life we can read with the finest of instruments. Vegetal imprints on photosensitive surfaces. Part 2. If the Anthropocene is defined by fossil fuel civilization, then we ought to recognize that this civilization has been the most productive and at the same time most destructive in human history. It has produced enormous abundance at numerous costs of health risks, disruption of ecosystems, costs with potentially suicidal risks to humans and to nature. Unequally distributed across the cultural and ecological communities of the world. I'll show that again so you can see what's happening there. The emotional space-time of climate trauma consists of zones that are entered at different rates depending on our positioning. There's the pre-traumatic zone, for those who have managed to shelter themselves so far. The becoming traumatic zone, for those who face loss of shelter and bearings in a readily imaginable, almost here future. The already traumatized zone, for refugees seeking shelter from wildfires, droughts, hurricanes, rising seas, and wars over land, water, and other climate-affected conditions. And the continuously traumatized, continuously post-traumatic zone, where we find indigenous and colonized populations for whom climate change is continuous with centuries of world-destroying, identity-rupturing trauma. These layers are interdependent, and how we engage with them will dictate how successfully we might navigate through the zone, assuming there may be a beyond to it. The paradigm case in trauma studies is the Holocaust, which Shoshana Fellman and Dori Laub consider an event without witness, not just because the perpetrators destroyed much of the evidence of what they did, but because the victims had no appropriate frame of reference to account for it at the time. Ecological trauma is about the witnessing of a catastrophe that has not yet occurred, or that has occurred in isolated instances of a broader, slower, and more cataclysmic unfolding that may or may not ever transpire in its complete form. Eco-catastrophe is a trauma whose perpetrators and victims are ill-defined and whose nature is often delayed, mediatized, spread via images and narratives rather than from direct experience. Awareness of the possibility of ecological collapse doesn't hit you like an oncoming car. Such awareness gathers slowly, accumulating evidence like clouds rolling in the background of our awareness until something tips us over the edge, taking us out of the familiar phase space of our everyday awareness of the world into a less familiar one that recognizes its utter insecurity and vulnerability. Part 3, the concluding part. It's worth considering 3 kinds of approaches into the space-time of Anthropocenic climate trauma. First is the approach of Chronos, the god of time, the time that is measured, counted, apportioned, and that we know will pass. This is the time of science and of measurement, the time that dates, that punctuates, the time of cause and effect. We try this, we watch what happens. Without scientific study, we wouldn't know the first thing about, say, climate change. This is also the time that finds us constantly pursued by our own demise. We will, after all, become one more layer of sleepy time on a many-layered planet. For those who know the film Stalker, which I've been referring to, we might wish to think of this as the scientist among the 3 who venture into the zone, the scientist who, knowing what's to come, wishes for it to be ended earlier to allow more time for whatever might follow. A second approach is that of Aion, the god that takes the measure of our time and installs it within the sacred time of eternity. This is the time of our world historical significance as it is told by tellers of tales and singers of refrains. The Anthropocene, rightly considered as a minor block of time in Earth history, is nevertheless a sort of achievement, an event worth heralding, but perhaps a cursed one. This is the time that can be recognized, turned into meaning, the time of the story of time, time anchored in the heavens, even as those heavens to some may look more like hells. But before and between them, there is the time of Kairos, the time of possibility within impossibility, the timeliness of the open moment, discontinuous, ruptured. Kairotic time is open time, the time of responsive action without guarantee. This is the moment in which we act in response to what we see, in action that amounts to a leap of faith. It is the time that comes to us when we least expect it, holds out its hand and asks, are you in or are you out? This, of course, is the stalker who is fully in or wishes to be. Then, of course, there is stalker's wife, who represents the emotional core of the kairotic commitment, who embodies what it means to be in. And monkey, their apparently telekinetic mutant child, who reminds us of what we are told every day by our own kids. And I think for the sake of time, I won't show this entire scene, but if you know the film, I'll speed it up a little bit. And you hear a train approaching on the soundtrack. If in the background you heard what sounded like a train, it's actually F-35 fighter jets that fly over the city of Burlington, Vermont, where I live. They fly over twice a day these days. There's the train. And in the interests of time, this just came out, a preprint from The Lancet, which apparently a large study survey in 10 countries that showed that 3/4 of young people between 16 and 25 feel the future to be frightening. In other words, we live in broken time, a zone of broken space-time, and must learn to navigate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian, for that very fascinating and moving, poetic, disturbing presentation, and for sharing the images and your thoughts. I will be taking questions in from the Q&A if anybody has something they want to respond or share. So I'll be keeping an eye on that. We have about 3 minutes if anybody has any questions. It struck me what you mentioned in terms of trauma, and your key example being a Holocaust, and this idea of the absence of a frame of reference is something that I see a lot in or that comes up a lot in the Voices from Chernobyl polyphony as well, with all the voices struggling to sort of like make sense of what happened at the Chernobyl explosion. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how perhaps that might have shifted, in the sense that we continuously inhabit this sort of like ruptured world. Surely trauma in a way is different in terms of eco-trauma compared to a case where there's the emergence of something radically new.
Well, so Ian Kaplan, who's a film scholar, and some other people have begun talking about climate change as a form of pre-traumatic stress syndrome that's affecting people, which I think that last point about young people clearly shows that there's a kind of trauma that comes with recognizing the scope and the scale of the climate catastrophe, the challenge, the global challenges that we're facing, and also recognizing how entangled these things are with all kinds of other issues, with social injustice, racial injustice. Certainly in this country, over the last year and a half, the pandemic has been an opportunity for people to really kind of affectively insert themselves into this zone, this way of feeling about the world, which is real for a growing number of people. So certainly there are events like the Chernobyl accident that bring about that sort of zone. And I think the fact that the film Stalker became a sort of template for a lot of people in the Soviet Union to make sense of the zone of evacuation, that's part of the reason why I've been attracted to that film and other films as ways of making sense of something that we are all feeling on some level. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
I think it also resonated a little bit with something Morton said yesterday. He commented sort of like in passing that he wouldn't have written hyperobjects in the way that he wrote it today, because he sees this sort of like oversaturation with it. And he also mentioned sort of also a little bit in passing that that we all feel it today through something like coronavirus, that it is sort of that maybe there's a shift in that sense of like unknowability, or in sort of like coping with that the emergence of that radical newness. All right, so thank you for this. I think I'll just iterate. I think Michael Mata wrote here, thank you, Adrian, for this powerful presentation. It is important to remember that in Russian and Ukrainian contexts, both with regard to Tarkovsky and Chernobyl's exclusion zone, zona is an informal word for forced labor camps, especially those situated in Siberia, and in particular for the gulags. This should add another dimension to the thinking of the zone. I don't know if you want to just briefly respond to this, or...
Thank you. I appreciate that, Michael. I do refer to that in my writing about Chernobyl, both in the ecologies of the moving image and in shadowing the Anthropocene, and it's something that I've looked at in visiting the zone and in interviewing people in primarily Ukraine, but also in other parts of the Soviet Union. But I appreciate your take on it very much.
I appeared on the screen also to reiterate on Michael's comment, but Nikolai, you've done this already. And also just wanted to add about the this zona that Michael mentions. It just made me think about the fact that, of course, Adrian, you know, that as Michael says, they're situated in Siberia. So those labor camps would be kind of out there in the direct interrelation with the so-called wild nature in those faraway parts of Russia. Mm-hmm. So I think that's also kind of a point to consider. I wanted to bring up, if I may, once again, the point about the children's and the youth's attitudes towards our potential futures or the lack of such. And it's a point which was brought up, like this idea of how youth views the ecological crisis has been brought up by Stan in the panel earlier, although in a much more hopeful register. And I also saw the results of this study, which were quite widely publicized lately. So I just wanted to ask if perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more on those lack of hope or lack of hope and hopelessness for younger generations in the context of their engagement with the media of film and other media, and what these films can say to those younger generations and how they relate to them perhaps differently than what we do. And maybe Nikolai, you also have points to add on that perspective from your waste aesthetics point of view.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to respond first, or you want me to add a little bit, Adrian.
Just briefly, I get my sense of young people's feelings and perspectives just from the students I teach. We have quite a large environmental program, and we get a lot of very activist-oriented students, but I can certainly feel over the last couple of years how there's been a kind of shift in how they and other students perceive the world. And I would just rather let them speak if I could. I don't want to speak for them. But I think that's maybe the point is to encourage listening to that generation of people and younger people as well.
Yeah, I think John Parham has raised his hand. If you can just unmute yourself. Yeah.
Hi, Adrian. Nice to see you. Thank you.
Hi, John.
Thank you for a really interesting paper. And I mean, obviously, the concept of the zone is a really valuable one I think we can work with. But I was kind of thinking about this before Aaliyah spoke, and I wanted to ask a question, sort of related question from the other way around, is that, so the sort of media producers, do you think talking about the sort of ubiquity of images of waste, for example, that we were earlier, do you think the popular media, whether we mean fictional media or news media, has helped take us into the zone so that we're kind of aware that we're in this zone? Or do you think they're still in denial about it?
Yeah, good question. I do think in the last few years there has been a movement among a lot of certainly the press, The Guardian being a good example, the New York Times and others, to really focus in on climate change, to speak, to write about it more directly rather than through the kind of indirection and hesitations and everything that had preceded that. As far as popular media, popular film and all of that, I've been looking a lot at the sort of media that my students, at their media consumption, which tends to be this much more fluid mix of stuff that comes across their screens in YouTube and Instagram and here and there, rather than looking for individual films or individual media objects that might do something the way that, 15 years ago or so, we might have thought that Al Gore, his Inconvenient Truth film, was trying to do. So I think that's a difficult question to answer, and you have to look very sort of holistically, broad spectrum at the media to get a more authoritative answer to it. And I don't really know the answer, but I'm cautiously hopeful.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll think about that one.
If I can just add to Parm's question or the dialogue here, that one thing that I guess relates to this question of which media product or which cinematic world might be productive or helpful in terms of navigating these various zones. You write in Ecologies of the Moving Image towards the end about this notion of the good film. It's one of the things that I always remember when I think about the book. And it's sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sort of seems to be this sort of defense of films that are more open to interpretation, right? It sort of like seems to play off this kind of like Bartesian idea of writerly versus what is it, like open and closed texts, in that sense that some of the good films are the ones that are, you write, effectively generative, right? That they do a lot of things in the world and they're good if they do different things. But I find myself agreeing with you, but if one was to sort of challenge it a little bit, do you think that maybe that sort of like pluralism can also have a sort of like downsides when it comes to eliciting specific sort of, agendas and sort of like, mobilizing particular political projects and so on and so forth? Maybe pluralism can be, immobilizing or drowning or sort of like somehow something that might do the opposite. Sorry.
I guess I would add to that idea of the good film. Now I would add the good film spectator. There's a way of allowing films to open oneself up to a kind of richness to a richer way of perceiving the world. And I think I focused on the films that have done that for me, and maybe for people who've grown up with this cinematic ideal of a film being able to do that for us. I think in today's world, we do have to shift into a more digital, more fluid kind of way of perceiving media, films within this more fluid media spectrum. So maybe the key to that is to look at perception and interpretation and film viewing and how we allow films or any media objects to open us up. So I think the examples that were there were suitable to the world of cinematic spectatorship, but that is kind of in motion right now today.
I guess it would be interesting to look at how like new media forms sort of engage with that criteria of open. Definitely interesting discussion, but unfortunately, turning to Chronos, I think we're about to be out of time, and we have to thank you, Adrian, for your presentation and your images and the discussion. And then I think we have to move on to the next segment of today,